Learning Chinese efficiently is a better goal for most people than learning Chinese quickly. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about learning efficiently, learning quickly, and learning effectively. These three terms are of course interrelated, but I think it's worthwhile to untangle them and see what that tells us about different methods for learning Chinese. It's not hard to find stories online of people who learn Mandarin quickly, for example. Maybe it takes them 3 months, maybe it's 6, maybe a year, but I'm sure you've seen stories like this. If we ignore the hype and self-promotion that is often involved in such projects, I think these stories can actually be quite instructive. Many people genuinely believe that it's impossible to learn a language quickly as an adult, which is clearly wrong, so showing that it's possible is a worthwhile activity in itself. On the other hand, I also think that such stories can have the opposite effect. If we perceive that there is too much distance between us and somebody else, we don't really see what they are doing as proof that we can do the same, but rather that they are a different type of human that can do these kinds of things, and we can't. So if a polyglot, for example, drops everything that they are doing, moves to a new country, does nothing but study the language in an immersion environment, and then comes out of the experience 3 months later with decent Chinese, this is sometimes not interpreted as Chinese can be learned quickly, but rather there are crazy people, I'm not crazy, and hence I cannot learn anything from this person's experience. After all, if you are only able to spend a few hours a week and have to stay at home, well, you can't achieve that much in such a short period of time. So learning Chinese quickly is about reaching a certain level in a certain amount of time, usually measured in, say, weeks, months, or years. But this is of course strongly dependent on how much time you spend per week, month, or year. It's a little bit unnecessary to feel disencouraged if someone reaches your level in just 3 months when it took you several years to get there. It could just be that you studied 5 hours a week and they studied 50 hours a week. I've mentioned this before on the podcast, but I've calculated that if you're really serious about learning Chinese for 3 months, you can invest more time than I did studying French for 7 years in school. So as usual, how much time you invest into a project is going to have a big impact on the outcome, and that means that learning Chinese quickly really doesn't work as a goal for most people. This is where efficiency comes in, because that's something we all want. If your goal is to learn as much Chinese as you can in 3 months, of course you want to have efficient methods. But if you're learning Chinese 2 hours a week, you also want efficient methods. It's about how much you get out of the time you put in. Before we go on to discussing efficiency in more detail, I think it makes sense to first talk a little bit more about learning Chinese quickly. People have different reasons for learning Chinese, and if your motivation is completely internal, meaning that you learn because you're interested and enjoy doing it, speed isn't really important, even though of course your strong interest will help you invest lots of time, so you will probably learn quickly as well. Learning quickly becomes more important if your reason for doing so is mostly external, meaning, for example, that you're studying to achieve a goal of some kind, such as getting good grades, or to be able to communicate with Chinese people, or maybe because you believe it will help your career. If such goals are important to you, then of course it's important to learn quickly, because since you're learning mostly for a reward that will come at the end of your journey, the earlier you get those rewards, the better. This episode is not meant to be about motivation, although that is something I'm planning upcoming episodes and articles about, but I think it's worth noting here that most research into motivation shows that internal motivation is longer lasting and more powerful in general. And I think this tallies well with most people's experience of doing things in general. If you have a strong internal motivation, meaning that you're doing it for pleasure, for enjoyment, because you're interested or something like that, that's something that can drive you to do quite a lot. Whereas if you need to force yourself to do this because you want some kind of reward at the end, well, you might be able to keep that up for a while, but I doubt you're going to do that for years and years. Naturally, most of us have more than one reason for learning Chinese, so you might be interested in good grades and find Chinese interesting to learn, of course. So even if this is a spectrum from external to internal motivation, we can place ourselves on numerous positions on this spectrum. While it might be hard to conjure up internal motivation from nothing, I do think all learners should try really hard to find methods of learning that they enjoy, because this will be much easier to keep up in the long run, and of course it's more enjoyable in general. For more discussions about this, you can check out my article Enjoying the Journey While Focusing on the Destination, and I'll put a link in the description. I will also include a link to a snippet from a lecture by Alan Watts, where he talks about the dangers of focusing on the destination too much. That being said, I think we can learn a lot by studying people who have focused a lot on the destination and trying to get there as quickly as possible. We might not be able to replicate everything that they've done because it's impractical if you have a family or a job or something else that stops you from investing all the time you have into learning Chinese. But that doesn't mean that the methods they use are useless if you spread them out over a longer period of time. A good example of this is a friend of mine, Scott Young, who I got to know during his project to learn Chinese in 100 days. And I met and interviewed him at the end of the project. He also wrote a guest post on Hacking Chinese describing his method and how he had studied and so on and so forth. And I'll put a link to that in the description. So the point with projects like this is not that you need to copy exactly what he did, or if you find somebody else who learned Chinese in 6 months or achieved some wonderful thing in a year or something. The point is that if they describe in detail what they did, you can look at that and see what of these activities suit you and your situation. And of course, you can't expect very quick results if you don't also invest an awful lot of time, but that doesn't mean that the methods that they used are useless for you. It's not even necessarily the case that it's worse to spread things out over time, so doing what he did in say 200 days might have yielded even better results because you have more time to digest what you have learned and so on. Naturally, if you dilute your learning too much and spend 1 hour a month, you are probably going to forget everything you did last time, so there's a limit to how much you can stretch things out. So what we're all after here, regardless if we want to learn a lot in 3 months or 3 years, is efficiency. Merriam-Webster defines efficient as productive of desired effects, and then especially capable of producing desired results with little or no waste as of time or materials. And if we put this in a language learning context, it simply means that we want as much positive results as possible for each unit time we invest. This is something everybody should be interested in, regardless if you're studying full-time or if you're studying just a few hours a week. It applies equally to the ambitious and the lazy and so on. I mean, who doesn't want to get closer to their goal for each hour invested? Now that we have talked both about learning quickly and learning efficiently, let's compare them directly to make sure there really is a meaningful difference between them. First, efficient emphasizes solid learning for the long term, while quick can also sometimes be about shortcuts that could come back and haunt you later. This is particularly true if you set very short-term goals, such as using rote memorization to learn a few hundred characters, or trying to impress non-native speakers simply by speaking faster even though your tones are completely off. Second, efficient is desirable for every single learner, including those who study part-time or in their home country. Quick only applies to people immersed in the language with strong external goals, which is in effect what I've been saying throughout this episode. Third, efficient is a wider concept that includes learning finer nuances, whereas quick smacks of sloppiness. The goal should be to get the most value for the time you invest, not rushing through to get to some arbitrary goal you have set. Fourth, efficient focuses on the road, quick mostly focuses on the destination, and of course especially the time it takes to get there. As we have seen, while being mindful of the destination is important, it should not be the only reason for learning. And finally, efficient is useful for those who desire speed, but quick is not necessarily helpful for those who strive for efficiency. Another way of putting it is that efficient methods can also be quick, but quick methods are not necessarily efficient. So let's move on and confuse things a little bit by including a third word, effectiveness. These two words are of course related, and they're also often used interchangeably, even though they have slightly different meanings, and that becomes important here. So in essence, an effective method is one that gets the job done. This does not automatically imply that the method is also efficient, even though it could be. For example, it can be argued that rote learning is an effective method for learning Chinese characters, I mean, it does get the job done, as proven by more than 1 billion Chinese people, but it's not very efficient though, because it also requires an insane amount of time spent throughout their education to learn to write characters in this way. That might be okay, because the writing system suffuses the whole culture, but it's very hard to replicate this as a second language learner. It simply isn't very efficient. So let's round this episode off with 2 things that I think that you as a learner can take away and apply to your own learning. So first, be inspired and learn from those who engage in rapid learning projects of different kinds, but identify and discard methods that won't work for you, such as those that require huge time investments or require you to immerse in the language, which might not be possible. Second, be on the lookout for and actively try to find efficient methods of learning. Yes, it's also important to note that something works, i.e. it is effective, but if we have any interest in reaching our goals sooner rather than later, we also want the methods to be efficient. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.